Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here on a Monday morning. Welcome to today's researcher talk organized by the archival at NCBS as part of our research fellowship program. For all those who are here for the first time or haven't yet found the way to our meeting with, the archive at NCBS is a public collection center for the history of science and scientific India. At the heart of everything we do is a single underlying philosophy, a commitment to enabling diverse stories. Our research fellowship program provides a path mission designed specifically to foster scholarship anchored in historical collections preserved right here in our archives. We are grateful to the NC Foundation whose support makes this program possible. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Siddharth Kankaria, who has been a member of the NCBS community and has been with the archives at NCBS between September and December 2025. He is an independent consultant in science, society, and justice. He works at the intersection of research, practice, and teaching across the themes of science engagement, education, and equitable access to knowledge. He holds a BS in biology from IIT in Bangalore and an MSc in science communication and public engagement from the University of Edinburgh. He serves on the scientific committee of the Public Communication of Science and Technology Network and supports individuals, institutions, and communities through strategy, sense making, and capacity building. This talk is based on his work as a research fellow and is titled Experiments in Built-in Inquiry, Scientific Temper and Grassroots Science Education in Rural India. Over to you, Siddharth.
Thank you so much, Bharati, for the kind introduction. Hello everyone, good morning. Very nice to see all of you here. Thank you for coming and taking all the time. I'm Siddharth and I've been working in science communication, practice, research and teaching for more than a decade. And something that I often think about is the idea of scientific temper, which I'm sure all of you have heard. And also how education in our country, especially science education, really is being brought about for the last few decades. So those are things that I frequently think about, and today I want to sort of try and attempt to connect those ideas not just in a theoretical or a conceptual way where scientific temper is a value that should be applied in science education, but really show you a case study of how scientific temper looks like in practice. So that's what I'm going to try and attempt to do today. So, okay. Let's just hope this works. Okay, great. So, what is science after all, right? When we ask this question, it's a seemingly naive, simple question, but it brings about a very pluralistic diversity of answers, right? Everyone will, if I was to ask each one of you what is science, you would come up with different kinds of keywords, right? Any of you like to share anything? Anyone wants to go for it? Don't think too much.
It's a way of living.
It's a way of living. Great. Anyone else wants to go? I really like making talks participatory. I don't want to give a monologue, which unfortunately this is going to be, but please feel free to interrupt and ask questions whenever you. Okay, so I'm going to move on. So is science only the outputs of science, the miracles, the technology, the applications, the wondrous things that science has enabled around us? Or is it also a way of thinking, as you very rightly said, thank you for that, or it's also a way of doing, living life, a method of living, a method of engaging with knowledge around us. So when we ask this question, there are lots of keywords that come up: curiosity, interest, observation, discovery, imagination, logic, observation, experiment, knowledge, discoveries, so on and so forth, right? So there are loads and loads of keywords that come up with the idea of science. And I want to bring you back to the idea of scientific temper, which is something that very nicely encapsulates a lot of these values. And so let me define it before I go on. So scientific temper as an idea was popularized and conceptualized by first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru in 1946 in his book, The Discovery of India. It's essentially a rational, critical, evidence-based way or approach to knowledge in life by rejecting superstition, dogma, and unquestioned authority. Now, this is not something which is new to us. It's been around way before Nehru, and it's not a really, really new way. But what Nehru did was he really sort of thought about it and brought it into the public conscience or the public imagination in a very unique way. And that's why the idea is often attributed to Nehru. When Nehru came up with this concept, he also envisaged it as a counterweight to centuries of colonial religious and dogmatic legacies, and he wanted to bring about change at the shackles of colonialism that India was recovering from after independence. So Nehru's idea was to really empower people in a way, by a value by which they could really make sense of the world around them. It was also listed as a constitutional duty in 1976, and here's the phrase that finds occurrence in the Constitution. It shall be the duty of every citizen to develop a scientific temper, humanism, spirit of inquiry and reform. Now, it's very interesting to see that scientific temper sits alongside humanism and the spirit of inquiry sits alongside reform. And this is very sort of foretelling why there's a particular reason why this is phrased in such a way, and I'll come back to the statement a little bit later, but I just want all of you to note that this is not in isolation, that science is being sort of treated as the panacea of all ills in society, but it's actually tempered by the spirit of humanism and reform alongside it. Now, Nehru wasn't the first one who came up with the term scientific temper. There are other instances of people in the past who have also talked about it. One of the key person who mentioned scientific temper as a term was Bertrand Russell. In his address called Free Thought and Official Propaganda in 1922, he talks about the need for thinking about science and the applications of the technologies of science in a way that is much more careful. So he's warning people that we really need to be careful about what the applications and the outputs of science are doing to us. But his invocation of scientific temper is very much limited to a utilitarian view of science, and he talks about why it's important to be careful about the fruits of science. But he's not really thinking about scientific temper as a way of education or a democratization of knowledge. So that idea is something that is still attributed to Nehru, and I just want to read a short excerpt from Nehru's book just to place the idea of scientific temper from an original primary source in context. So it is the scientific approach, the adventurous and yet critical temper of science, the search for truth and new knowledge, the refusal to accept anything without testing and trial, the capacity to change previous conclusions in the face of new evidence. Now, these are some of the phrases which really encapsulates the idea of scientific temper as we all popularly sort of know about it and think about it. So Nehru came up with this term, he popularized it, he spoke about it in many forums. But I also want to sort of bring you back to Ambedkar. Now, Ambedkar hasn't really spoken about scientific temper in a direct primary source, but Ambedkar has in various ways talked about the spirit of scientific temper or the spirit of critical inquiry in his own ways. And there are lots of people who've spoken about this. So, for example, for Ambedkar, scientific temper grounded in critical inquiry and evidence-based reasoning was not just a mindset, but a weapon to combat deep-rooted social evils like superstition and casteism, right? So Ambedkar may not have spoken about scientific temper directly, but he does talk about the need for a critical inquiry or skepticism or rationality to be able to root out social evils like casteism, prejudices, and social inequities in society. Ambedkar was also influenced by the writings of John Dewey, where he thought of, and then based on Dewey's readings, he thought of scientific temper as the potential to challenge unexamined traditions and prejudices by cultivating a collective democratic will to inquire, to examine, to discriminate and draw conclusions only on the basis of evidence. Now, again, he does not use the term scientific temper, but these are very much in line with the idea of scientific temper. And I'm bringing in Ambedkar at this point because I also want to widen our thinking around scientific temper as not just an Nehruvian idea, but also something that a lot of people were in conversation and dialogue with at that time. And it was really shaped in the public conscience by a lot of thinkers like that. So just to give you a few more examples now, I do want to state that scientific temper is an idea which has been spoken about by hundreds of people. There are thousands of writings on scientific temper, and it's not very possible for me to really encapsulate a summary of all of that. What I'm trying to do is just show you a glimpse of certain viewpoints on scientific temper in order to really lay a foundation before I talk about the rural science education programs. So once the Nehruvian idea of scientific temper sort of takes root and people start talking about it, a lot of scientists also come on board and go off the term scientific temper because they find it as a very valuable way of justifying why science is important, of justifying what they're doing, why the work is important, to secure funding, and so on and so forth. A key example of scientists really commenting on scientific temper was this meeting at the Nehru Center that happened in Bombay in 1981. And it was a huge collection of scientists who got together and thought about rationality, critical inquiry, and scientific temper. And they came up with this statement. So here's an excerpt, and this meeting was led by Aksar, Ramana and Bhargava, PM Bhargava, who is also the founder of CCMB for context. And so they describe that scientific temper is an attitude of mind which calls for a particular outlook and pattern of behavior. It is of universal applicability and has to permeate through our society as the dominant value system, powerfully influencing the way we think and approach our problems, political, social, economic, cultural, and educational. So you can see that what started off as a value or virtue to aspire to by Nehru is soon becoming a load-carrying weight. So scientific temper has now the weight of so much of expectations of curing social, economic, political problems and evils in society. So very soon, people start using this as a term to sort of as a panacea of all evils in society, and that is problematic, and I'll get to that a little bit later. The scientists in their statement in 1981 also say that the fullest use of the method of science in everyday life and in every aspect of human endeavor, from ethics to politics and economics, is essential for ensuring human survival and progress. So you can again see there's an exaggeration of the importance of scientific temper to be essential to human survival and progress, right? So you can clearly see that the scientists are really co-opting it and making it much more bigger and load-carrying than it seemed to be originally in Nehru's idea. For context, Bhargava was also the one who was instrumental in getting scientific temper in the constitutional phrase that I mentioned. So here's another reference which shows that Bhargava was very instrumental in convincing and advocating for people, for policymakers to incorporate scientific temper in the constitution. Okay. I'm running past these very quickly, but I can talk about each of these in the question and Q&A if required. So after the scientists, scientific temper also starts appearing in a lot of policy documents. It's being invoked in educational policy, in national policy, in development, in discourses on modernity. And so very soon it starts coming in a lot of policy documents where it's repeatedly invoked again and again and again as something that needs to be inculcated, that needs to be applied in the Indian population, and so on and so forth. So you can see there are mentions of scientific temper in all kinds of policy papers, and it becomes something that's invoked repeatedly. But what starts happening at this point when it gets translated into the policy context is that scientific temper loses some of its original ideas of inculcating a spirit of inquiry or its democratic and educational sort of potential, and it becomes being observed only through the lens of nation building, of development, of modernity. So it gets a little bit sort of transformed or transmuted to only being seen from the lens of development and nation building, and it loses some of its democratic potential in that process. Soon enough, a lot of humanists and social scientists also start criticizing the idea of scientific temper, because this idea starts taking root in all kinds of social discourses, and very soon people start critiquing it and finding problems in it. And scientific temper soon acquires a scientistic framing where it sort of privileges the way of science or the method of science as being much more important, or the only way of getting to truth, or only way of engaging with knowledge, and it sort of marginalizes other ways of looking at the world around us, and it acquires a scientific framing very soon, right? So Ashish Nandi, who's a key sort of critic of the idea of scientific temper, says that we really need to move from a consciousness which accepts the hegemony of science towards a consciousness which accepts science as only one of the many imperfect traditions of humankind. There's also the idea that the scientific and scientific temper becomes a function where the input is state-controlled science and the output is national development. And a lot of the policy documents also start seeing scientific temper as a way to, get more youth to take up STEM as careers. So it also becomes very utilitarian in the sense that you must inculcate scientific temper so that you can become a scientist and so that you can contribute to the national development, right? And this is the idea that exists till today in our education system, where if you study science, and I was just talking to someone about this yesterday, that if you study science, you're expected to become a scientist and contribute. If you do anything else after a degree in science, it starts to become problematic. So some more critiques of scientific temper. Ashish Nandi, again being a key critic, writes a counter-statement of humanistic temper where he critiques the idea of scientific temper, and he says more than scientific temper being inculcated in citizens, it is humanistic temper that needs to be inculcated in scientists, and they should really engage with the social sciences. And there's a lot that he says in this essay, and I would encourage you to read it. And I don't agree with all of it, but this is one thing that I do agree with, that there is a need for humanistic tempo or engagement of scientists with social sciences and humanities as well. Then there's Vandana Shiva, who's a key environmentalist and also warns us about, a dogged pursuit of scientific tempo can also lead to, application of science which are harmful to the environment and ecology, and she warns us against these kinds of interpretations of scientific tempo. And then we have Geeta Chattar, who we've all had the privilege of interacting. She was the UPHC chair last year. Geeta writes in 2005 that the need of the hour is to develop a culture of science that takes cognizance of the relation between science and culture, a subculture that allows for an integrationist approach to knowledge, cemented by a broad-based, reflexive, and self-critical attitude. And this she wrote 20 years ago. I also want to show something that she wrote last year, and which, embarrassingly, I discovered much later when I was doing this project. I wish I had discovered it sooner, but it's something that I really agree with, and I do want to sort of read out a little bit from it. The scientific temperament approach, on the contrary, Nehru suggests, might be emancipatory in unique ways, and that is what we must excavate. She also says that we need to be critical towards, and she talks about an informed science criticism, and she's written many papers about it. She talks about we need to be critical about the idea of scientific tempo in science, and we need to ask who gets to do science, who does not, who are our scientific heroes and role models, how would an Ambedkarite view on casteism in science inform the aspiration of humanism, and how do we make space for marginalized groups to not only enter science but also stay there. So she's seeing this from the lens of being more critical towards the application and pursuit of science. And in the end, she writes that it might be worthy to begin reimagining the idea of scientific tempo. And this is something which is closest to how I feel about the idea of scientific tempo, who has been engaging with it for a few years now, is that there is a lot of pros and cons in the idea of scientific tempo, but there are also a lot of lacunae and weaknesses. And it might be time for us to really think about reimagining scientific tempo for it to work in the day and context that we live in, right? So at this point, I want to sort of go back to the idea of rural education, and I want you to remember this aspiration to reimagine scientific tempo towards the top. All right, so what we soon start seeing. So if we start looking at science education in our country, and we start looking at it critically, keeping in mind the inspiration that we drew from the previous two slides, is that there is a chasm between what is said and what actually happens is wide and deep. Now, this is true for science, but it's also very true for science education. And I want to interpret this from the point of view of science education, that what's really being aspired to or what's being told in theory is not what really is happening in practice, and they are different things and they may look differently. So we need fundamental changes in our system of education. And by the way, this is from an exhibition that was supported by the National Council for Science and Technology Communication, and it was actually prepared by HSTP, which is the case study that I want to talk about, and was the exhibition on method of science. And they have really, really beautiful illustrations, so I'm going to keep using them in my slides. So I'm just letting you know that this is where all the beautiful pictures are from. So there's a chasm between what is being said and what is being done. And there's a lot of sort of hullabaloo about scientific tempo as being something that we must inculcate. But ironically enough, that it's not being invoked in the context of science education, right? So we have been doing science education in a way that has been going on for a very long time, and we have perhaps not been as critical about what's working and what's not working in education. And so I make the case that we perhaps need to employ or apply the idea of scientific tempo in the context of science, but also science education itself. One such initiative which did that to a moderate amount of success is the HSTP program, the Hoshangabad Science Teaching Program. And that's the case study that I really want to dive deeper into today, and I'll be talking about in detail from now on. So one such innovative attempt at bridging the widening chasm between what is said and what is done is the Hoshangabad Science Teaching Program. Before I go on, some context. So Hoshangabad is a small town village which is now officially renamed as Narmadapuram. It's a scenic central Indian city located on the south bank of Narmada, and it was founded in 1406 by Sultan Hoshangabad. That's where it gets its name. We can all imagine why the name was changed recently, so I will not go into that. But you can see that Hoshangabad is literally in the heart of India, right? And it's a poetic irony that we're going to also be talking about education and going into the heart of education today. So that's Hoshangabad for context. And one person I do want to talk about a little bit, although he's not the only person behind HSTP, but he was a key thinker behind HSTP, and I do want to share a little bit of context about him. So Anand Satgopal is a scientist. He was born into a privileged background in science. He was born in Lahore in 1940. He had a privileged scientific trajectory, did a PhD from Caltech. He then returned to India and joined TFR as a scientist. But he was also very alienated from road-driven pedagogy and felt disconnected between lab science and rural Indian realities. So he really had this aspiration to try and connect science and apply scientific temper to how science was being taught in rural India. So that prompted him to resign from TFR just a few years after joining, and he moved to Hoshangabad to start an initiative called Kishore Bharati, which I won't talk about a lot today because I want to focus on HSTP. But Kishore Bharati was sort of the precursor to HSTP. And his resignation was radical for his time, given he moved away from privileged position, elite access, and the urban ecosystem of Bombay to a much more marginalized rural district to build community-centric science education. Now, Anand Satgopal wasn't the only person behind HSTP, but I think his journey is quite pivotal in terms of understanding what was really happening in Hoshangabad. Right. So here's a short timeline of educational efforts that Anand Satgopal and his colleagues and other initiatives around him were involved in. You can see in 1971, Kishore Bharati was founded by Satgopal and his friends. Then a year later, the Hoshangabad Science Teaching Program was started by Kishore Bharati and Friends Rural Center in Rasolia. From 1975 to 2006, this entire cluster of people keep engaging with the government, keep engaging with policymakers, keep engaging with different research institutions across the country to try and build resources, to try and bring funding, to try and advocate for change in education policies in India. And it's a continuous process. So HSTP is not an isolated program in the middle of nowhere. It's really contextualized by a lot of initiatives, people, organizations that were operating in this ecosystem, right? And then there were also initiatives like Eklavya and Lokshala and the Bharat Jan Vigyan Jatha, which were the people science movement. Now these are really, really fascinating initiatives, and I wish I had 4 hours to go into all of them. But for paucity of time, I'm only going to focus on HSTP. But I would really encourage you to go read up more about these initiatives, and the archives has a lot of interesting material. So please, and they're freely accessible, so please do go and read more about them. Okay. So key actors in the HSTP program, just for context, is that there were NGOs like Kishore Bharati and Friends Rural Center, which started HSTP. There were non-profits like Eklavya. There was the MP state government that was also involved. There were academic and research bodies like TFR and DU, Delhi University. There were professional organizations like the All India Science Teachers Association. So there was an entire ecosystem or cluster of people who were contributing to what was happening in HSTP. And before I go on and show you some of the workings and the initiatives within HSTP, I do want you to bear in mind that this was again an entire ecosystem or cluster or ecology of people who were making all of this possible. So it really took a village to do all of this. Again, some key people, resource people, Anand Satgopal, of course, Yashpal, who you all might have heard of, was intricately involved in curriculum development. And there was Hridayakant Diwan, who was involved in teacher training frameworks. There were other people science movements, and then there was Vinod Raina, Sushil Joshi, Sarna Saxena, lots of people. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but just to show you that this was again a village of people trying to get something done. Okay. So again, I'm not going to go into a lot of details in Kishore Bharati, but just for context, Kishore Bharati was an informal science education program founded in 1971 by Anand Satgopal, and it was an experimental space for democratic science, intensive field surveys, community dialogue. The idea was to really listen to people, go and talk to them, do surveys and talk to people in the villages to really understand what would they like to see in terms of education, in terms of what really is useful to them, and not just do a pedantic pedagogical thing where I tell you this is a textbook and you follow this, right? And the impulse behind doing all of this was that they wanted to weave together natural and social sciences through grassroots engagement and informal education efforts. And these impulses or principles or values again crop up in the people science movements, in Eklavya, in Lokshala, in Vijay. So these are fundamental philosophies or principles that keep coming up again and again in all of the ecosystem of initiatives that I showed you. So while Kishore Bharati was an informal science education program, it was supplementing what was going on in government schools. They soon realized in a year that if they really wanted to change anything and have real impact, they would have to interface with the actual educational institutions, the government school or public schooling system, to be actually able to have any kind of impact. So with that impulse, the Hoshangabad Science Teaching Program was started as something that was happening within the school ecosystem and not as a supplementary thing to it. And it was predominantly focused on the inquiry cycle, which is basically something that we all do as scientists, is that we observe, we hypothesize, we test, we reflect, and we go back. And it's a cycle that allows us to iteratively reflect on what's happening, what's working, troubleshooting, and then finding out what works or what doesn't work, right? So this is again something which I think all of us are aware of, so I'm not going to go into detail. So it was launched in 1972. The Madhya Pradesh government adopted it officially in 1978, 6 years after its launch. It was a process-based learning where curriculum follows a rigorous inquiry cycle, and it was embedded within a formal education system rather than a supplementary effort. Okay. So one of the key sort of philosophies or principles of the HSTP program was learning by discovery or learning by doing. Is that students really needed to do things to learn rather than just read things in an abstract textbook. And this idea of doing things with their hands, of making education more participatory, more dialogic, was something that was at the core of why HSTP was functioning. So they wanted children to discuss and debate, they wanted them to perform experiments and observe, they wanted them to tabulate data, to analyze data, to troubleshoot, to iteratively reflect on what's working and what's not working. The teacher was supposed to be a guide and not a source or fountainhead of knowledge, for example. The children went on a lot of field trips and they learned from the environment. So this learning rooted in social context, rooted in the environment, local environment around them, was one of the key founding philosophies of HSTP. And again, so learning by discovery, learning through activity, learning from environment, just different ways of saying the same thing. What I want you to read is that what united, so there were a lot of people, it was a collaboration. What united them was a conviction that science could not be handed down from experts to children. It had to emerge from the child's direct encounter with her environment, right? So this is breaking away from, in science communication, for example, what we call the deficit model, where you assume that someone is a bucket which is empty and you pour knowledge into it and you're filling up knowledge. Now that was debunked and it doesn't work that way. We move towards more dialogic or participatory ways, and then this is exactly trying to move towards a more participatory way where there's active conversation or dialogue and there is negotiation of what is the truth versus being told this is it and this is what you have to mug up and vomit out in an exam, right? So the emphasis on rooting education in the direct local environment of the child or the student was something that was very important. Okay, so this is just a flowchart to show you the ecosystem of initiatives that was happening. I will talk about each one of these in detail, so just bear with me. I'm just going to run through them quickly. So there was continuous development of innovative curriculum and teaching materials. There was teacher training where teachers were repeatedly trained in different ways of participatory science education, and it was not a one-off capacity building workshop. They were continuously followed up, they were supported, they were given resources, there were periodicals where they could share their learnings and reflections. So there was an ongoing continuous process of really negotiating what participatory science education can look like, rather than just telling them that, hey, you should do this, and then leaving them out in the open to figure it out themselves, right? So what I want you to notice from this is that there was an entire process and ecosystem of support system provided to students, teachers, even parents to some extent, which I'll argue later. So there was academic support where researchers and scientists from big universities and research institutes were also contributing to teacher development, not to the students, but developing the teachers, doing teacher training workshops. There were people who were employed or volunteering for HSTP who went to the schools and made sure that what the teachers had learned in the workshop, which was like a summer camp or something, was actually being implemented and applied in an effective and impactful way in the classrooms also. So there was a lot of hand-holding, there was a lot of support that was provided in this thing. And keep in mind, this is a small town in central India. This is not some big budget corporate CSR funded initiative which has a lot of unlimited funding and resources. They are really doing with bare minimum resources and they're doing so much, which is really fascinating to me how they were able to do all of this.
Siddharth, what is letters to Savaliram?
Yes, so Letters to Savaliram is as an initiative where students wrote to people, organizers of HSTP, to ask their questions. And the reason Savaliram came up is that a lot of teachers were very scared of students asking them questions because they were worried that they might not have the answers to them. So teachers always had this innate fear or socially conditioned fear that they didn't want to take up open questions. They only wanted to teach what they had been trained in, what they had read up in the textbook. And this is an artifact of our education system that teachers felt very underconfident about, answering questions. To circumvent or sort of go around that, they came up with an initiative where Savaliram was an initiative where students wrote questions about anything in their environment, and the editors or the people who were running HSTP wrote answers to them. And I will talk about Savaliram in a bit, so I'll show you some examples. HSTP not just talked about or advocated for participatory science education, it also changed a lot of the admin and governance around it. Right? For example, it really advocated for reforming assessment and examinations, and I will talk about that as well. It developed a lot of hands-on kits which were self-sufficient so that the teachers were not really scampering around trying to find things to run the experiments in the classroom. So they also made these self-sufficient kits which were sufficient for teaching one particular concept or subject or topic in science education. There were a lot of academic and administrative structures which interface with the policymakers, with the state government, with other NGOs, which also brought in a lot of lived experience through horizontal channels of knowledge. And there were lots of extracurricular inputs, including science communication and popularization initiatives. There were science festivals, there were people science movements, which were also happening at the same time, where there were a lot of scientists and social reformers going around the country, doing discussions, debates, theatre, folk art. And so all of this was also getting HSTP was also interacting with a lot of those things, and I'll come to it. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is the workbook, which was called Bal Vigyanik. So in order to make science, participatory science education possible, they came up with this workbook which was called Bal Vigyanik. And the workbook was basically a sort of reforming of the textbook where facts were not just told. There was space for students to contest and negotiate and see for themselves whether this facts holds up to truth. So it was also inculcating a way of experimenting and learning by doing and discovering. So that was Bal Vigyanik. And there was also the science kits that I talked about. And the science kits, for example, there were a lot of experiments. So for example, there was matchbook microscopes, there were button pulleys which showed principles of physics. There were probability games with dice that showed how probability worked. Or there was also dissecting of flowers and leaves which children can then see under the microscope. So there were a lot of experiments, and I will talk about these in a little bit. Okay, so the heart of the program of the HSTP program was Bal Vigyanik. So one anecdote from how Bal Vigyanik was employed was in one classroom in Bankhedi, a teacher asked, "Where does the sun go at night?" The question drew laughter and then silence from the students. The children, many of whom had never seen a globe, began to draw the sun and earth in the dust outside. They debated, they rotated a clay ball, and in that moment the cosmic became local. And I think this really struck me because this is such a beautiful encapsulation of bringing science and participatory education to those rural villages. The HSTP kit, for example, was inexpensive, repairable, embodied a simple idea that science is not the property of the rich, it is an act of shared curiosity. Right? So these are also showing that these kids were really trying to make things much more rooted in social context around the kids, rather than making it abstract and something that they read in the textbook but could not relate to or really conceptualize or have an intuition for. I also want to say that a lot of this might seem very obvious and it might have happened when we were students, but I also want to remind you that these were the 1980s and things were very different. So a lot of these experimental or participatory or practical science learning is something that we might have grown up with because now things have become commonplace. But this was also like 60 years ago from now, sorry, 40 years ago from now. Okay, so this is an example of a workbook where the kids were asked to look at plants around them, and they were asked to look at how leaves were clustering. So rather than telling them different kinds of morphologies of plants, they were asked to look at plants around them, and then they were led into a discussion of why the leaves were clustering in different ways, why there were single leaves, why there were multiple leaves at every node, or why there were leaves at alternate nodes, right? And these plants were also not any random plants, they were plants that were locally found in and around Hoshangabad and in Madhya Pradesh. So the same workbook would not have worked in Kerala or Haryana, for example. So it was very much localized to that. And HSTP again then grew into many more states later on, and then these things were also localized for the respective context. But again, I'm only showing you things from Hoshangabad and Madhya Pradesh to keep it sort of concise. So this is an example where kids were really asked to think about science by observing, by doing, rather than just looking at a textbook and reading things. Hoshangabad Vigyan. So Bal Vigyanik was the workbook where the kids were allowed to sort of engage with interactive science thinking. Hoshangabad Vigyan was a periodical which was meant for the teachers. It was a periodical which the teachers could reflect and share learnings. They could talk about problems that they were encountering. They would talk about things that work and didn't work. So this was predominantly meant for the teachers to really have a way to network and share insights and learnings in the community. And so I want to show you a few excerpts from Hoshangabad Vigyan, because this is the place where a lot of the reflections of the teachers are captured very beautifully, and I think it really shows how the program was also running. So let's go through some examples of Hoshangabad. So at one point, the school was supposed to have a lot of kids where they were going to do these dissections, and the kids didn't really reach in time, or there was some delay that the kids didn't reach. And so I'm going to read this in Hindi but then translate it in English, so this bear with me. So परिणाम ये होता था कि पहले दिन ही शिक्षक व विद्यार्थी पूर्णतः किट पर निर्भर हो जाते थे। ऐसे विचार ही नहीं बना पाए कि प्रयोग करने के लिए चीजें अपने आसपास से खोजी जा सकती है या किताब में लिखी चीजों के अलावा भी कुछ कर सकते। So the thing is that when these kits were first delivered, the students and the teachers often became dependent on the kits to sort of think of what to do next, and they didn't really think about that they could, if the kids were missing or if they were delayed, they could also collect things from their surroundings. And so this is also a way of scientific temperament action where they're realizing that we don't have to depend on pedantic ways of knowledge collection, and then we can also do things with things around us, right? So soon the teachers realize this, that the kids, even though they are missing, they can also recreate the kids in some ways because they have been trained in a summer camp about these kids. So they were like, we can recreate this. And then so they asked the students to go and get things from their surroundings which they can look under the microscope or can dissect. So ट्रेनिंग के दौरान जब आप लोगों ने कहा कि बच्चे जो शौक से सामान इकट्ठा करेंगे तो हमें आपकी बात पर एकदम बेकार लगी. So we didn't believe when you told us that the kids can also collect materials from the environment. परंतु स्कूल में जो तो बच्चे को कहने की देर थी कि सामूहिकरण के लिए इतनी चीजें लाएं कि सामान कहाँ रखे जाए वो समझ ही नहीं आया. Soon when the kids actually were told to get things, they got so much stuff that we didn't have enough space to keep all of those things, right? बहन जी ऐसे पत्तियां बच्चों ने इकट्ठी करी जो हमें ना कभी देखी थी ना नाम सुना था, बच्चों को हर एक पत्ती का नाम पता था. So this, they're saying that they're writing to other teachers that the kids collected so many different kinds of leaves that we had never seen these leaves or we had never heard of them, but the kids knew the names of each and every leaf that they brought. And this is a very interesting insight because this is flipping the hierarchy of who is the source of knowledge in the classroom, where the kids are actually teaching the teachers and they want the leaves and the plants that are growing around their neighborhoods or their surroundings to be included in the science experiment in school. And then they are telling the teachers that this is the plant that grows near my house and this is what it's called. So the teacher ceases to be the only source of knowledge and the students are also being a source of knowledge in a partial way. So we can see that there's a little bit of democratization of who the source of knowledge is. There's a discourse and a dialogue and a participation where everybody is learning together, right? It's not just that the kids are recipients, passive recipients, and the teachers are active sort of givers of knowledge, right? So this is a very interesting insight where the kids sort of teach teachers as well in the classroom. Another example is that they had gone on a field trip where they wanted to do floral dissections. So they wanted to pluck flowers from from the garden or from the field and really use these dissection needles to see the anatomy of the flower. And many of us would have done these experiments in school where we dissect the flower, we see the different parts of the folds of the flower, the stamen, the pistil, so on and so forth. Now, for some reason, they forgot to take the pack of dissection needles, which was required to dissect the flowers and see what's underside. So बच्चे गलती से डिसेक्शन नीडल ले जाना भूल गए. They forgot to take the dissection needles. 2-3 बच्चे भागकर बबूल के पेड़ों पे लटक गए और खूब सारे बबूल के कांटे तोड़ लाए. So when we said that we had forgotten the dissection needles, the teachers were very disappointed and worried that the entire field trip is going to go to waste. But then the kids said that no, wait, we can get you these thorns from the babul trees. So they went to the babul trees, they got the thorns, and then they came back. उस दिन से kids से dissection needle निकल गए. So from that day they stopped using dissection needles in the kit, because once they start doing dissections with these babul thorns, they realized that these babul thorns are actually much more sharper, and they gave them better control at dissecting the flowers than the dissection needles themselves did. Also, the babul thorns did not rust, unlike the iron dissection needles. So, and they were also much more cheaper. They were free. You could just plug them from a babul tree. And so then the teachers reflect later. Bankadi block में उस दिन बच्चों ने आज 206 स्कूलों में चल रहे ये कार्यक्रम को बबूल के कांटे देकर डिसेक्शन नीडल से लगभग 3,000 रुपए बचवा दिए. So at that point 3,000 rupees was a huge amount, and it was a significant amount. So because the dissection needles were removed from the kit because of the babul thorns, they also ended up saving money, and they were also rust free and free of cost. Right? So this is another example where scientific temper is in action, and not in a pedagogic sense where, oh, you should inculcate this value of scientific temper. It's something that the kids have themselves come up with, and you can see that the kids are developing this sense of, navigating the world around them, where they're able to solve problems, and this is again a good indicator of how they would grow up to be adults who want to do this. So the last excerpt from Hoshangabad, which I want to show, and I want to read this in full because this is very interesting, is from a parent or a guardian. And so far the site of education was only looking at students and teachers, but I want to argue that it also affected the parents or people back at home. So Abhivavak ki nazar se, so a parent writes in Hoshangabad Vigyan sharing his or her, we don't know if it's a his or her, so it's just Abhivavak. जब से ये नया विज्ञान स्कूलों में चला है, बच्चे न केवल स्कूल में बल्कि घर पर भी तरह तरह के प्रयोग हेतु सामग्री जुटाने का प्रयोग करने में लगे रहते हैं. इससे मुझे परेशानी तो अवश्य होती है कि लड़का क्या क्या ढूंढता फिरता है गलियों में, नाली में, बगीचे में, किंतु बच्चों की पढ़ाई की रुचि देखकर गुस्सा शांत हो जाता है. So since this HSTP program has started, the kids are not just doing weird experiments in school, they also started doing this at home, and they keep finding things in drains, in gardens, in the soil, in the dirt, and I get annoyed by this, but I do see the curiosity and the inquisitiveness of the child, and then my anger gets placated because I see that they're learning something. वो कभी बिजली की मोटर बनाते हैं, कभी विभिन्न प्रकार के पट्टियां इकट्ठा करते हैं, कभी कीड़े मकोड़े पकड़कर शीशों में बंद कर लेते हैं. Sometimes they're making motors for electricity, sometimes they're collecting weird leaves and flowers, sometimes they're collecting insects and piles, and so on and so forth. They're also doing this in the bare afternoon in the summer sun, and they're also doing this at night. So he or she goes on to say that they're completely obsessed about doing these things that they're learning at school, and it's become a nightmare for me. But the question that I want to ask all of you in the Hoshangabad Vigyan, the readership of Hoshangabad Vigyan, क्या ये विज्ञान वास्तव में बच्चों को वैज्ञानिक बना देगी? ये प्रश्न मेरे दिमाग में हमेशा बना रहता है. So this parent or guardian is asking, is this science education really going to make my kid a scientist? This is something I keep thinking about, right? And now again, this is very interesting to me because it's also kind of refuting the idea that if you are studying science, you have to do something with it, something utilitarian with it, either become a scientist or practice science in a daily basis. You can also do science for the joy of it, for the wonder of it, for the curiosity, for the inquisitiveness, for just having a way of looking at the world with a starry-eyed or a blue-eyed way of looking, right? So this is again a reflection by a parent where they're kind of unlearning in their head where, is this going to make my kid a scientist? I don't know, and I keep asking this to myself. And they're asking it to the other readers of Hoshangabad Vigyan as well. Okay, so coming to Savali now. So as I said, the teachers were a little bit skeptical about being in a vulnerable position where they were exposed and kids could ask them any questions. And so they, even though they were trying to incorporate this participatory way of teaching science into their methods, there was still some bit of unlearning to happen where they were a little reluctant to be completely vulnerable and exposed to being asked any question out of the sum. So when the classroom activity was happening, they tried to restrict themselves to the topic or the subject that was being discussed because they had read up about it and they were prepared, but they didn't feel confident about they didn't feel confident in saying that I don't know and I will find and get back to you. Right? That's something that was also very important because they were seeing themselves in a social role where they were supposed to be the fountainhead of knowledge, but they were not comfortable not being in that space. So Savaliram was started in response to that intuition, where kids could write to the organizers of HSTP, and they had enough time to find the answers. Even if they didn't know, they could read up, search, and get back to them with an answer. So this was a postal question answering service. So kids sent questions through the post, and then they were published in Hoshangabad Vigyan or Bal Vigyanik in terms of answers, and they were obviously curated to some extent, but it covered a very wide range of topics. So questions included: why doesn't the lizard fall off the wall? How does a rainbow form? Why don't these birds get electrocuted? Where are the roots and leaves of the our bale plant, for example? Right? So Hoshangabad later on became digitized online. So there's a website which you can also access called the Savaliram website. And on the mobile, you can also see that they are clustered into various different kinds of themes and topics. So everything from biology, chemistry, physics to earth, environment, philosophy, practice of science, technology, humans and society, geography, language, arts, recreation, right? So you can see that this is not just relegated to the natural sciences. It also opened up this chasm of that science or knowledge has to be bucketed into different kinds of subjects. Once you start asking questions, the questions don't really follow which subject or theme or discipline they're coming from, right? Questions can be interdisciplinary, can be multidisciplinary, and the structure of the website also started reflecting that over time as they started curating and archiving more and more questions. And now the website has a huge archive of questions that you can go and read. I don't want to get into each of the questions because that's a separate talk in itself, but I would encourage you to go visit the website and read some of the fascinating questions that the kids have asked. So I want to read a little bit of what Shukla writes in his article called Pedagogy of Wonder. The program Savaliram led was a series of fictional exchanges between a curious child and a scientist symbolized this relationship. They captured the tenderness of dialogue, and it was pedagogy as care. So this is also opening up vulnerability of a site of dialogue or discussion, a site of not knowing, and a site of discovering things together, the teacher and the student together, even though it was a fictional sort of thing in the magazine. But it sort of opened up an avenue where teaching wasn't just a didactic activity where you had to listen to the teacher and follow their instructions. It opened up a space which was tender and careful, and I think that's also very interesting. And when Professor Sargopal was asked why Savaliram really mattered, he said because science is not about fact, it's about a way of being in the world. Again, idea of scientific network coming in again. If the teacher does not experience wonder, how will the child? So I think this is also interesting that they are also focusing on inculcating a sense of wonder in the teacher, the parent, the people around the kid and not just the kid, right? The kid does not exist in isolation. The kid does not just inculcate a sense of wonder about the world on its own. They really have to be inspired and they mimic and see the people around them. So it's equally important to pay attention to the spirit of wonder, of joy, of curiosity, of inquisitiveness in the teacher itself, right? And the teacher training program that happened under the HSTP program, which I will talk about in a few minutes, was a perfect example of how they inculcated a sense of wonder in the teachers itself. You will see the teachers started becoming curious kids and they were toying around with things, they were asking questions, and the teachers really got an opportunity to be in a space where they could just be themselves and not have the weight of being the responsible adult, right? So that's again a very beautiful thing that comes up. So the need for Savaliram was felt early in the program as teachers expressed a strong reluctance to encourage children to ask questions. They feared that they would not be able to answer many of the children's questions and this would affect their status. And this is something I already said, so we'll move on. Okay. One more thing that I quickly want to mention, and I know that I'm finishing towards the end of my time, is that the HSTP program also did a lot about rethinking exams and assessment. And I won't go into a lot of detail because this is much more of the admin side. But I do want to show that they did think about open book exams, which is something which is very much in vogue today. But in the 1980s also, they were thinking about open book exams. They believe that an examination should evaluate what the children are taught or what they're expected to learn. The best examination would be the one the teacher himself or herself conducts. That is, every teacher should have the freedom to test his or her students. And the idea was that the examination should not be nationalized at scale where everybody is doing the same thing. And I don't think this is more pertinent today, in today's contemporary, given what's happening right now. But the idea was to make the examinations also local, contextualized, and decentralized, and not to sort of have the same exam for everyone across the country, but to really have exams where the teachers could really gauge the students in their own way because they know the students best. Of course, it's more administratively difficult, I will give it that, but it also opens up a space where there's a lot more capacity for the student to look at the student's progress more holistically rather than just on an objective set of questions that the children can memorize and then take out during the exams, right? So this is also making examination and assessment more holistic. And the idea is not to test whether the kid has really understood a concept. The idea is to also understand what else the kid could be supported with. So again, a lot of things were done in terms of the exams, open book exams, unlimited time for writing an exam, lots of practical examinations, which again has become commonplace now, but at that time it was not. Group setting of question papers where lots of teachers got together and thought about questions that would be the most interesting for the kids to engage with, and so on and so forth. Here's an example. So students were allowed to take Balvigyanik and their answer books at the examination hall. The HSCP didn't expect children to memorize information in a textbook. They were really allowed to refer to their things. So essentially an open book exam. Examination was to evaluate the development of skills in scientific perspective and their ability to use scientific method and logical analysis. Again, the idea of scientific temper coming in. The questions would be such that they judge the children's observation and analytical abilities, experimental skills, curiosity, creativity, conceptual clarity. But many questions were raised about the open book examination, mainly by parents, because again, there was a social conditioning that exams were seen as something to test and rank the kids in a particular order. And the parents really protested against this, saying that if the kids are taking the textbook, then what's the point? The exam is to see whether they know anything in the textbook. And if they're taking the textbook to the exams, then they're essentially going to find all the answers. So the textbook was also seen as an object where you could find all the answers. And this was again the idea of science being static, of science being fixed, of science being not changeable. And that is completely against the virtue of science being something that's always being updated, always testing what it knows and sort of reproducing its assumptions, right? So this was also something that came up, and there was some tension between the parents and the teachers, also not understanding how to set questions in a way that was not something that they could easily find in a textbook. So there's a lot of material about how the open book examination is conceptualized, but I won't get into that today. Here's one example of a question that was before HSTP and a question after HSTP. So the question is about separation of different materials, and it says describe at least 3 different methods for separating substances, which is again something that you can rote learn. But in HSTP, they basically gave a table of whether it's soluble in water, whether it's undergoes sublimation or not. And then it was asked, how will you separate a mixture of camphor and ammonium chloride, which is something that the kids really don't need to know whether what is soluble in water or what is sublimable. They could really see and then use, again, process of science or the method of science or scientific temper to come to a conclusion. And it's really about being able to deduce the answer in the spot rather than memorizing things. Right? So that's one example. Last thing I want to quickly mention is teacher training and follow-ups. This was again a very massive exercise. There were lots of things happening. There were summer camps, there were follow-ups, HSTP people came into the schools and made sure that the teachers were well supported, and they were troubleshooting. There were officials from HSTP who came and saw that the teachers were able to use materials in the kids properly. So it was not just something which was one-off, where the teachers were given a resource and told to apply it in their classroom pedagogy. They were actually continuously supported. And then there were also periodicals like Hoshangabad, where there was a lot of discussion and debate about what's the best way to go about it, how do we need to update the curriculum. So you can see that the process of iteration, of feedback, of reflexive loop in science education, and I would argue the application of scientific temper to science education itself is constantly being seen in this process of HSTP, where things are not fixed, they're not static, they're always in dialogue, in conversation with each other. So again, teachers perform the experiment themselves, they discuss and analyze the results, they collect additional information and data, they attend lectures and go to side trips. So this is what happened in the teacher training camps, for example, and they were made to feel like students would feel exactly when they were the teacher, right? So this is also again a role reversal where teachers were actually students and the resource people from the universities or research institutions were helping them think, and so this was not just the teachers also given a kit or a resource or a lesson plan and told to implement it. They were actually made to also engage in the process of science themselves, for them to be able to appreciate and understand and also engage with the students when they were faced with questions as well, right? So again, a lot of participatory stuff happening here, which enables the teachers and empowers them, and it's not just about telling the teachers to do something better, it's actually enabling them to do something and empowering them to do something better. Perhaps the most radical feature of HSTP was reimagining of the teacher. Teachers attended summer camps where they performed experiments, discussed their observations, wrote reflections. They were encouraged to see themselves as learners first. One teacher from Harsul famously said, HSTP has made me a student again. This reversal of hierarchy was revolutionary. It replaced authority with humility, certainty with inquiry, and When India's education system was beginning to treat teachers as cogs in a bureaucratic machine, HSTP trusted them as thinkers. And I think this really encapsulates what HSTP, why it was successful in the limited way that it was, because it really trusted teachers and enabled and empowered them. Okay, so there were monthly meetings and there were school follow-ups, and I don't want to get into this, so I'll move on. They would follow a personnel under training. They went to schools, they observed classroom procedures and helped the teachers. They wrote their follow-up reports. These follow-up reports were discussed with teachers at monthly meetings. So you can see that it's a very, very complex process where so many things are happening and they're all feeding into the philosophy and the practice of HSTP. Okay. So one assessment or evaluation of how the HSTP program was doing was a report that they published in 2004. And in that report, it says that almost 60% of the teachers said they were not scared of teaching science after the HSTP experience. They did not feel the need to rote memorize things. And now, again, this is a very nice snippet that shows that the teachers also felt empowered and confident about after this. So monthly meetings, as I said, the concept of a school complex. So the school did not operate in isolation. The school was talking to other schools. The school was talking to parents. The school was talking to students, to other teachers. The school was talking to universities and resource people. The school was talking to the state government and policymakers. So the school really was, again, a node of activity where there were lots of people intersecting and interacting. And that is what made HSTP what it was. So essentially, concluding what I was trying to say for all this while is that HSTP was a great example or case study of taking science to the community. It built up children's activity centers, library, lecture series, science fairs, so on and so forth. It linked education and society. Innovations in educational administration were equally important. It was not just the philosophy of making education participatory and learning by discovery. It was also complemented or supplemented by changes in the administration and governance of how education was happening, and that I think is equally important as the philosophy of HSTP. So there was a lot of decentralization that also happened. So summarizing my talk, what we can learn or what I think is interesting about the HSTP as a case study for thinking about scientific temper is obviously it builds scientific temper. I don't think there's any doubt about it. It builds skepticism and inquiry-based rationality. It also built and encouraged reflexivity about science and science education itself, science in the classroom and science education in sites like Hoshangabad Vigyan, in the monthly meetings, in the teacher training camps. So there was also a lot of reflection, a lot of iterative development, feedback, thinking about what works, what doesn't work, what should we keep in the curriculum, what we should remove. So it also encouraged the idea of reflexivity in science education itself. It made teachers, students, and parents comfortable with uncertainty, troubleshooting, and the process of science, which is something that is not easy to do in a traditional pedagogic sort of site of the classroom where you just read from a textbook. Uncertainty is always, textbooks are a combination of scientific knowledge which is already outdated, right? It's something that we are sure about, which is then it translates into a textbook. But making science as an active process of becoming, of a contested process where knowledge is always being contested in real life is doing a lot of favor to the idea of science and scientific method and scientific temper, which I think textbooks don't always achieve. Knowledge is co-created, as I said, contested and participatory. And I think this is the crux of what HSTP enabled in the rural science education system in Hoshangabad. There was also a lot of focus on making education community-centric. So there was knowledge which was rooted in village life and local context. You can see that the trees, the plants, the flowers, the dissection needles, the links to agriculture, the links about, there's also a lot of material about HSTP going and talking about menstruation or women's rights and how young adolescent girls need to be educated about this. So you can see that they're bringing in a lot of context from what is being faced by people in those areas and then linking it back to education in a very interesting way. So knowledge was rooted in village life in local context. There was democratization of knowledge, and sometimes the role of the teacher and the student was interchangeable. There was a dialogue, there was participation, there was discussion about what is true and what's not. And this helped the students also develop skills for solving everyday problems. There was multilingual access to knowledge. I didn't talk a lot about multilingual, but a lot of the HSTP resources were also available in Hindi, in Bharati, in other languages, which also made it easier for and accessible to more students who were more comfortable reading it in their mother tongue rather than reading it in English. And there was a dialectical relation between education and society, which is always true, but it was made much more visible in very direct ways, where you could see that society and education were intermingling with each other, were impacting each other in a reciprocal relationship. And I think that, again, HSTP is a great example of that. Rethinking rural pedagogy is something I think is very important. Teachers as facilitators and guide, and not as a fountainhead of knowledge, as the source of all knowledge. Learning by doing and discovery rather than reading and listening. So anti-rote pedagogy. Questioning and critique as learning norms and processes, and not something that needs to be quashed and subverted. It was actually encouraged to ask more questions and think about things critically. So again, this is something which is a subversion of traditional pedagogic science, where questioning is usually not really encouraged all the time because teachers don't have the time or the resources. But here, questioning became a key way of learning new things. Iterative teacher training and empowering teachers in the process was also very, very important. Last but not the least, coming back to the idea of reimagining scientific temper, the quote from Gita that I borrowed and trying to again tie it back all together, is that HSTP was a great example which allowed us to move from a theoretical and contested articulation of scientific temper to a more grounded reality of what scientific temper can look like in practice. It moved away from a more scientific framing, excessively focused on nation building and development, to a more freer framing of what ST can enable in everyday life, how it can really interact with your local life on a daily basis. And there was multi-pronged development of an education ecosystem of inquiry. It was not just a teaching resource or a lesson plan that was given to the teachers. It was actually a very, very complex and complicated ecology of actors and systems and initiatives and organizations that were working in cohesion together to make this possible. So there was an ecosystem of inquiry that was created. Last but not the least, ST for looking at science and science education more critically and reflexively. That's something that I really feel very strongly about, that I think science and science education needs to also be looked at critically. We cannot just hero worship it and say that it needs to happen. Of course it needs to happen, but there are also flaws that we need to overcome for it to strengthen and make sure that it's doing the job it's supposed to do. So in conclusion, HSTP was a great experiment in making scientific temper teachable, participatory, and rooted in community. It built a social ecology in which scientific temper could be practiced as inquiry, dialogue, and collective negotiation. It was not something where science was static, it was something that science was active, it was in negotiation, in contestation, in experimentation together. And it highlighted the need for recentering science not around experts or concepts necessarily, which we often do in science education, but around communities, around the method of science, and around critical inquiry. With that, I want to thank everybody who helped me. So Nirupama, Janvi, who I had a lot of conversations with, Geeta, because I borrowed heavily from her ideas, Parvati for all the support that she's given me in all these months, Samata, because I had a lot of conversations about Anand Sadgopal and Kishore with her, Venkat for all his critical inputs, Samira for all the conversations and suggestions to what I could do, Ravi for again all the admin help, and the entire archive team. Thank you so much, and yeah, I'll take questions now. Yes.
Thank you so much for that. As someone interested in science communication and science education from a sort of a theoretical perspective, this was absolutely fascinating. I was wondering what became of this program, what kind of impact it had on any future legacy.
So I had a few slides on the challenges it faced, and it was shut down in 2002. I kind of removed them because it was very depressing for me to talk about, but I will show it to you. Let me show you something. So I just want to read a little bit from here, which is that although the crisis had been brewing for over a year, the actual moment of reckoning came after the District Planning Committee, which is not an elected body, passed a resolution in its meeting held on February 2002 recommending the closure of HSTP. The BJP MLA from Itarsi, who had moved to the resolution, based the recommendation on the following reasons: that the chapter on electricity used by the program encourages students to touch live wires, the children find it difficult to collect leaves as required by one of the chapters in botany, and the parents are not happy with the program. So you could see that this is very frivolous, and it was contested, and there was a lot of pushback by teachers, by HSTP people, but it was very abruptly and sadly shut down. And the reason given was that they were not having enough of an impact in terms of measurable impact. So it got because it was so interconnected with the government and the policy interventions, it also had vulnerabilities where the funding was coming directly from the state government and it was shut down very sadly. I really feel like it's a loss but there were other initiatives like Eklavya, Lokshala, Vijay that came up and had more or less the same constellation of people, so things were sort of transformed into other initiatives. But this particular program ran for 30 years, from 1981 to 2002, 31 years, and it was shut down in 2000.
Follow-up, has anyone done a study of what the students who went through the program did next? Like whether...
So there have been many studies where people like 2004 and onwards have tried to revisit the program, look at what it did, what it didn't do well, what could have been done differently. And they interviewed a lot of the people involved in the organization. They interviewed teachers and they interviewed students who had by that time, maybe in the 1980s, had already become adults. And so there is a report which was published by HSTP, by Eklavya, I think, which has a lot of excerpts and snippets from what teacher liked, what students and teachers liked about the program. It doesn't really go into the details of what they did after this, but you could see the impact of the program really had a lasting impact, because even 30, 40 years later, the students who were kids in the program still remember certain specific examples, anecdotes, like the dissection videos and stuff. So yeah, to answer your question, I don't think there is a conclusive account of what the teachers did, but I'm sure the teachers carried forward a lot of this in more indirect ways in their teaching, because they still were teachers. They just didn't have the administrative support or the entire constellation or ecosystem of things happening. That was taken away. But I think the archival material on Hoshangabad Vigyan, on Bal Vigyanik, continued to be used. Ain Sawaliram website, for example, continued to be used in many different ways and built. Yes.
And I'm just looking for your opinion here.
Sure.
Why do you think they went for this multi-pronged approach of targeting students' experience, teachers, and parents? Would it have made sense to focus all of the resources entirely on the teachers and parents? And my hypothetical answer is that you need to break through the resistance somehow, maybe seeing it in action would have helped. But I'm just looking for your analysis.
So I don't know for sure what was going on in their minds when they came up with this program, but my guess would be that there were a lot of initiatives at that time which were already doing exactly what we said, that focusing on teachers and asking them to inculcate scientific temper, inculcate conceptual understanding of science. But all of these initiatives also saw science as a tool for developing the nation, and so there was also a sort of set path of why they were asking to do this. The reason why this was different and effective and interesting is that they tried to move away from the end goal of science and they focused on what's happening right now rather than what's going to happen in 10 years. And I think the reason why they focused on students and teachers and parents and the community and the ecosystem was that they realized, and they were all products of the system where most of the focus was on teachers and schools. And so they realized that this was not really working. And that's why I think they tried something different, is my hypothesis. Clearly, they got a lot of things right, a lot of things were effective. There were also challenges, so I didn't talk about the challenges, but there were multiple challenges in getting funding, in getting resources. The teachers were often frustrated because it was a very significant shift from what they had learned or trained as a teacher to do. There was a lot of pushback from parents because they felt like, and when it came to higher sort of classes like 8th standard onwards, and board exams used to happen in the 8th standard at that time, there was also a lot of worry and tension that the parents had in terms of that this is not going to translate into like measurable outcomes or outputs where kids could get a job after this, right? So again, it was existing in the context of the social system at that time, and there was a lot to unlearn at that point in time. So there was a lot of challenges, and the reason this got shut down also was partly because people didn't really appreciate or realize the value of this as we are able to in retrospect today. But also it ran into a lot of political and sort of policy kind of frictions and tensions, right? And I think this is a frivolous reason given that children are touching electricity wires, which was not happening. But you can see that it's frivolous just by the way the report talks about it. So there was a lot of pushback. A lot of people tried to like undo it, and they said that it's going to be shut down across Madhya Pradesh. Then they backtracked and said that, oh, we are only shutting it down in Hoshangabad because right now we don't have the funds. But then in a year or two, they shut it down across 13 districts in Madhya Pradesh. So you could see that this was a political decision and it had to happen one way or the other. There was a little bit of backtracking back and forth in order to do it. Instead of doing it in one shot, they did it more slowly. But clearly, it was something that was decided by the powers to be rather than. It was not because of the teachers or the HSTP people that it was shut down. They were not constrained or not able to carry it forward. It was higher ups which kind of shut it
Yeah. So really great talk, and it's really insight to all of the history of education. It was like giving new perspectives. So I've been wondering, like, basically this kind of trend of this practical and education reframing to focus on student learning and creating scientific paper through the environment around them. This is being recently is being replicated in cities, mostly in the private schools, most of this world of schools. So this kind of education is now again being more privatized and under capitalistic system. So it's like again removing this kind of education from the rural ecosystems, because the rural ecosystems are being cleared, and mostly people don't. An activity like current or the leaves of trees around you, most rural spaces are now don't have those more because of those diversity of trees, or the diversity has been lost in the. So in that sense, after HSTP had been shut down, had there been any other attempts to replicate this kind of education in rural?
So again, I showed you a timeline of initiatives, Eklavya, Lokshaya. So a lot of the people involved in HSTP were also involved in those. So to some extent, this was being carried out in other ways. But your point about a lot of this kind of science, participatory science education being localized to urban places and international schools or these fancy private schools, is precisely the reason why I chose this case study, is because I wanted to look at rural science education, where things can be done in a much more resource-constrained environment, in much more simpler ways. There is multiple difficulties, and I wanted to appreciate that there's lack of resources and funding, obviously, but also the communities, the parents, for example. It's more difficult to convince them of or make them see the value of this. Also, the teachers also may not have been privileged enough to access or go to a fancy education, have a fancy education degree. So they're also operating in a very, very resource-constrained environment and doing the best they can, and they're always overwhelmed. And to do this in a rural context where everybody enjoyed, like you could see the sense of wonder and joy coming through from the parents, from the teachers, from the students. So I think to do that in that resource-constrained environment in 1980s in a rural town in Madhya Pradesh is what is fascinating to me, because it's easy to do this in a well-resourced urban international school, for example, and it's being done right now. And there are these maker labs. What's that initiative that the government started? These tinkering labs, that artificial tinkering labs, right? So that's essentially trying to replicate this where kids have a place where there are tools and there are materials and they can come and do this. But I think the judgment on whether artificial tinkering labs have really taken off and done what they were supposed to do is very, very superfluous, and I don't think they have achieved what they tried to achieve. So there have been many attempts to replicate this, but I don't think they have been as successful, at least not in these kind of rural constrained environments.
How would you say an early career researcher in these times would contribute to develop a scientific in rural India?
I think in NCBS, ICTS, ISC, for example, there are lots of initiatives where people actually go to neighboring districts of Bangalore, like an hour or two from Bangalore, and they go and teach there. So there's something called Notebook Drive in ISC, and I think NCBS and ICTS also used to be part of it. So I used to be a part of, when I was in ISC, I used to be part of Notebook Drive, where we, on Children's Day, we used to go and do a lot of fun activities and stuff. So there are many initiatives. There's also this PDFA postdoctoral program which teaches undergrad kids, and that's again more privileged, I would say, than going to rural ecosystems. But even in the limited time and energy and effort that you can put into it, there are many ways for you to also get your hands dirty and embrace yourself in the joy of teaching and learning together. So, yeah, I would encourage you to explore some of this.
So it's such that in hindsight you perceive a lot of problems in program. And you also mentioned that in 2004 they did conduct interviews including so I'm really wondering, for a lot of rural communities, from my lived experience, science education is a vehicle for them, or at least a perceived vehicle for them to obtain a lifestyle beyond their current needs, right? At least from what I've seen.
Right.
A lot of parents push their children into pursuing science with the understanding that it will afford them a better lifestyle in the future.
Right.
And I'm wondering if this perceived value is more of an academic value than a ground reality for people who haven't seen maybe, I don't know what has happened with this study. But I went through an alternative school where by the end of it, even though we were really fascinated by science, we were really bad at writing any kind of exam. And that did not differ as much because we were from a privileged environment.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering what that value quantification looks like for you.
I agree with you. I think the value is not just academic, it's also shaped by a lot of social context. Like, for example, in the 90s and early 2000s, especially for middle class Indians, doing a degree in IIT, for example, was really seen as a gateway to economic, financial stability, good job prospects, and so on and so forth. And I think while that fact can be true, it can also be true simultaneously that also really pushed us into a very tunnel vision, narrow-minded way of looking at science education. What initiatives like HSTP are really doing is that they're not saying or negating that you cannot achieve success or financial stability with science education, but they're saying that inculcating a sense of curiosity, of wonder, of inquisitiveness helps you and goes far beyond just economic or financial prospects. It's, again, as Nehru said, it's a way of life. It's a way of looking at the world around you. It's a way of being curious. It's a way of being skeptical. And this is not just in the realm of science. It can also extend into the realm of politics, in the realm of social sciences, of society, where you ask questions. And I think this is something which is in the current day and age that we're living in. Having critical attitudes or skills, not just scientific temper, but also being able to question and sense when you need to question things is so underrated and important, right? We don't, and I think I don't need to say any further that it's a very important skill to have, right? So I think initiatives like this really get to the heart of really inculcating that sense of criticality and skepticism, which I think is not easy to do. It's not something that you can teach someone or you cannot transfer in a one-directional way. It really has to be inculcated in the social milieu that the student or the child is going up. Which is why the focus on teachers, on parents, on communities is so important. And it's also important to change their view of science only being a gateway to success. It can also be it can also change their understanding of science as something that can help you solve your problems around life, right? Especially in a village ecosystem, having a scientific bent of mind can be the key to solving so many problems around you. And you don't always have to do a PhD after a degree in science. You can also use a scientific way of looking at the world without really thinking as science is the only way of looking at the world. Right? And I think that's what I'm trying to get at. I don't know if it's come across, but that's where I think my fascination with this is that it's not really hero worshipping science as the epitome of human progress. It's acknowledging that science is very important, it has given us stuff, but it's also encouraging us to be critical of science and to ask questions. And I think that's where I'm connecting the idea of scientific temper and Geeta's call for reimagining scientific temper in this case study, retrospectively, to look at that how we can really think about scientific temper and science, method of science, process of science, in a more community-centric way rather than just a value to aspire to. Right? So it's not just an aspirational value; it's something that really is rooted in your life and helps you, in your day-to-day life. And I think that's the best way you can inculcate something rather than by not being didactic and didactic.
I completely agree with you. I'm just wondering if this is reflected in 2004 survey.
Oh yeah. So in the report that they did in 2004, yes, I think definitely teachers, students, you will find a lot of excerpts where they say that they really value the program, they look back on it retrospectively and realize that they were able to do this because they had this outlook on it, and so on and so forth. So there is some material out there. I'm happy to share the report. It's like a 30-40 page report, so you can read through it. It's very interesting.
There's a question on Zoom.
Yes. Yeah, anyone on Zoom, if you have questions, please feel free to write them. Yeah. So the question is, I have a specific question related to parent feedback you mentioned a while ago, and mentioned how teachers and students are still looking at this training as something that will add a tangible value to their kids' life, exactly as what you said. They're unable to understand the shift happening in the way the children are being curious about knowledge. How do you think this behavior shift can be brought among these adults? I think HSTP is the sort of an example of case study where this change can be brought about in adults, because when the kids are being involved and engaged with the programs of HSTP, it's not just the kids who are inculcating these values. They're also going back in their home, having conversation with their parents, and it's a slow and tedious process, but it does happen slowly, and it might take a generation even. But I think this is, and in the example that I showed you, the parents were annoyed that the kids were rummaging through the neighborhood and trying to find things, but they let the kid do it because they saw the curiosity and the joy that the kid had, right? And I think that is something that the parents can understand. They may not understand what this is going to add to the kid's life in terms of value or tangible outcomes, but they can see that the kid is enjoying it, and I think maybe sometimes that is enough for the parent to be convinced and also rethink their own outlook. So I hope that answers your question. Sure. Any more questions?
Thank you, Siddharth. This has been a wonderful discussion. I hope this also been a great start to the week for me. And I go back to Anil Gopal's paper to look more closely at the results that I achieved. Thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you.